We have this really deep-seated tendency as human beings to completely romanticize the concept of shared belief.
Oh, absolutely. We treat it like the ultimate virtue.
Right. We view it as the ultimate social glue, like it's this beautiful, invisible binding agent that, we're told holds families together and builds communities and sustains entire civilizations.
Right, from day one.
Yeah, from day one. Whether it's from your parents or teachers, we're taught that finding a group of people who believe exactly what you believe is like the pinnacle of belonging. It's the warm blanket of human existence.
So comfortable.
Very comfortable. But I want to pose a direct challenge to you, the listener, right at the top of this deep dive today. What if that so-called glue is actually a highly volatile acid?
Okay, that is a phenomenal provocation.
Mm-hmm.
Because what you were describing, the comforting warmth of shared belief, it often masks a very dangerous structural reality.
Exactly. I mean, what if the very thing you think is holding your world together, your social circle, your corporate culture, your political faction?
Your whole reality.
Right. What if it is structurally designed to eat away at your society from the inside? That is the question we are unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at a highly analytical, incredibly dense lecture that deconstructs a specific foundational text.
Specifically, Surah Al-Ankabut, chapter 29, verses 19 through 25.
Yes. But before we get into the weeds, I want to set some very strict parameters for how we are approaching this.
Which is crucial, honestly, because the moment you mention an ancient text, a lot of people immediately shift into a different mode of listening.
They brace themselves for a sermon.
Exactly. They expect theology.
And we are absolutely not doing that. We are not approaching this source as a sentimental theological sermon. We are not here to preach, and we aren't looking at this through the lens of traditional religious sentimentality. Instead, we are putting on the hard hats of master sociologists and systems engineers.
I love that framing.
Thanks. We are dissecting this text as a highly rational, almost algorithmic blueprint for civilizational survival. Like, we are looking at the cold, hard mechanics of human societies, why they rise, why they stagnate, and why they ultimately collapse into ruin.
And if we are wearing our systems engineering hats, the core thesis we're extracting from this material centers around a pretty devastating critique delivered by the historical figure of Abraham.
Right. This happens in verse 25 of the text.
Yes, verse 25. He exposes what is referred to as the idol system.
Yeah.
Now, when we hear idols, our modern minds, we immediately go to literal stone statues or maybe golden calves.
Yeah, we think of ancient people bowing down to inanimate objects because they just didn't know any better.
Right, we think of it as just primitive superstition, like, oh, they thought the rain god lived in that rock.
Exactly. It feels very disconnected from us.
Precisely. But the sociological analysis presented in this lecture, it strips away that superficial reading. It reveals that the idol system is actually a sophisticated social cohesion racket.
A racket. I love that too.
It really is. It's an engineered in-group dynamic. People don't bond over the idol because they genuinely believe the rock makes it rain. I mean, they aren't stupid. They bond over a shared fiction because upholding that fiction provides immediate, tangible social benefit.
Networking, basically.
Exactly. It provides networking, it provides safety in numbers, it provides an identity. But Abraham's critique points out a fatal structural flaw in this architecture.
Which is?
When that shared fiction inevitably fails under the crushing weight of objective reality, that warm social bond doesn't just quietly dissolve, it violently inverts into mutual betrayal.
That inversion is terrifying. And honestly, it's something we see happening constantly in modern times. But to really understand how a society or a group collapses into that kind of vicious betrayal, we first have to understand the baseline.
Right. You have to know how the system is supposed to work.
Exactly. We have to define what it actually means to progress. Because you can't understand a system's collapse if you don't understand what its baseline functionality is supposed to be. And the lecture we're looking at highlights a fascinating directive early on in verses 19 and 20. It points to an imperative to, and I'm quoting here, travel the earth and observe how creation began.
Which is such a striking command when you look at it through an empirical lens.
It is, because usually when people read ancient texts and they see the word observe or reflect, they assume it means to, like, sit under a banyan tree, close your eyes, and meditate on the mysteries of the universe.
An internal vibe.
Yeah, an internal, almost mystical reflection.
But what this lecture argues, and this is a massive paradigm shift, is that this directive to travel and observe is a purely scientific, empirical imperative.
It's hands-on.
Completely hands-on. It is not asking for philosophical daydreams. It is talking about paleontology.
Yeah.
It is talking about biology, geology, archaeology. The text is demanding physical observation of the material universe.
So it's saying, go out, dig up the earth, look at the physical evidence, study the fossils, put the single-celled organisms under a microscope, and reverse engineer the evolutionary steps of how life actually developed.
Yes. It's an anti-stagnation mandate.
Yeah.
You cannot understand universal laws purely through theoretical or academic pondering inside a closed room. You have to look at the physical data of how existence actually moves forward. And you have to do the legwork. You have to travel.
Which brings us to a massive linguistic breakdown that honestly stopped me in my tracks when I was going through the notes for this deep dive. The text discusses the anatomy of stagnation, the exact opposite of that forward movement, using a very specific Arabic word, ithm.
Yes, ithm.
Now, in English translations, this is almost universally rendered as sin. And the second you hear the word sin, all sorts of cultural baggage comes with it.
Tons of baggage.
You think of breaking a moral rule. You lied, you cheated, you stole, you coveted your neighbors, whatever. You broke a cosmic speed limit.
You think of a ledger in the sky tallying up your bad deeds.
Exactly. But you're telling me the linguistic root in classical Arabic paints a completely different picture. Because I have to admit, I was pretty skeptical. How can a word so heavily associated with moral wrongdoing mean something entirely different?
It's a completely fair skepticism. But this is where understanding classical Arabic linguistics completely changes the paradigm. Classical Arabic is deeply rooted in the physical realities of desert life. The root of the word ithm, which is athim, it does not originally refer to a moral failing in the way to think of it. It refers specifically to an exhausted, fatigued camel.
A tired camel. Wait, so to sin is just to be a tired animal? That seems like a massive leap from our modern understanding of morality.
Let's contextualize it sociologically. Imagine you are part of a vast caravan moving across the harsh, unforgiving Arabian desert. In that environment, survival is not an individual game.
Right, you can't just wander off.
Exactly. It is a collective systemic requirement. Survival depends entirely on the continuous forward momentum of the group. If the caravan stops in the middle of the desert, it runs out of water, it runs out of supplies, and everyone dies.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now, imagine one camel in that caravan that just gets too tired.
Yeah.
It loses its vitality. It gives up, stops walking, and falls behind the caravan. That specific physical state of falling behind, of losing the capacity to move forward, of halting the march, that is atham. That is the root of ithm.
Okay, wow. That is profound. If we extrapolate that sociologically, to sin in a civilizational context doesn't just mean doing something naughty behind closed doors. It means to stop moving forward. It means losing your vitality, your momentum, and falling behind the continuous evolutionary march of humanity.
Exactly. Stagnation isn't just a sign of a lazy society or a complacent corporation. It is systemic death. If you stop evolving, if you stop updating your understanding of the universe, you are committing a civilizational sin against the very laws of progress.
You are the camel sitting down in the desert waiting to die, and you are endangering the entire caravan.
Precisely. And the lecture pairs this with another linguistic revelation that is just as jarring. The word that is so often translated into English as hell, the word jahim, what does that actually mean? Because we picture a subterranean cavern full of fire and pitchforks.
Right, fire and brimstone.
But linguistically, jahim translates to a state of standing still, or ultimate stagnation. Again, strip away the medieval artwork and the mythological interpretations. Sociologically, as a systems engineer, jahim is the condition a society enters when it permanently stops moving.
When they think they've arrived.
Yes. When a nation, a corporation, an institution, or a culture decides, you know, we have figured it all out, we are perfect as we are, we have nothing left to learn, and we don't need to adapt to changing realities. At that moment, they enter jahim. They become rigid. They freeze in time.
So it's like a stagnant pond. It just stops flowing and starts getting toxic.
Well, yes, but think more systemically. Think about complex technology.
Like refusing to update your phone's operating system.
Let's build on that. If you have a computer system and you decide, I love this current OS, it's stable, I know where all the buttons are, I am never going to update the code again, you might think you are just maintaining a safe, comfortable status quo.
Right, you think you're preserving order.
But the environment around the system, the broader internet, the hardware standards, the new security threats, the global network, it's constantly moving. It never stops. By choosing to stand still, your operating system doesn't actually stay the same.
Relative to the moving environment, it falls behind.
Exactly. It becomes highly vulnerable to new viruses. It becomes obsolete. It can't run new applications. And eventually, the friction between your stagnant system and the moving reality causes the whole thing to crash entirely.
Life is continuous movement. The moment you stop updating the kind, you aren't just resting, you are dying. And the friction between your refusal to move and the universe's demand for movement, that friction generates heat. That is the fire of Jahim. It burns the system down from the inside.
Precisely. Any society that relies on mere repetition, just mindlessly cloning the thoughts, habits, and technologies of their ancestors, without injecting new intellectual or scientific vitality, they are actively walking into that state of Jahim. They're writing their own obsolescence.
Man, that is bleak. But if standing still is the ultimate systemic failure, we really need to understand the mechanics of how the universe actually moves forward. We need to look at the systems engineering of existence itself.
And the lecture spends a significant amount of time breaking down a highly specific, multi-stage process of universal progression.
Right. But before it gets into the text, it references a late 19th, early 20th century Scottish philosopher named Andrew Seth Pringle Pattison. Why bring a Scottish philosopher into a lecture on classical Arabic sociology?
It's a brilliant inclusion, actually, because Pringle Pattison pointed out a severe structural limitation in the English language, particularly when it comes to philosophical and scientific granularity. In English, we essentially have only one word to describe how things come into being, and that word is creation.
Right. God creates the universe, a painter creates a masterpiece, a software developer creates an app, and a toddler creates a mess in the kitchen. We just apply creation to all of it.
Exactly. It's a linguistic catch-all. It flattens a vastly complex physical and metaphysical reality into a single, blunt instrument of a word. Bryn Pattison was deeply frustrated by this because as a philosopher trying to understand the mechanics of reality, English didn't give him the tools to differentiate between originating something from nothing versus shaping something from existing materials.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the Arabic terminology used in the Quranic text doesn't have this problem. It breaks the concept of creation down into highly specific, distinct, sequential technical phases.
Okay, let's take our time here, because this sequence is the core engine of the whole lecture. The source identifies three critical terms: Amr, Ibda, and Khalq. Let's walk through these as if we are reverse engineering a massive architectural project. What is Amr?
Amr is the directive energy. It is the initial intention, the underlying law, or the absolute blueprint. Think of it like an architect's master schematic. Before a single physical brick is laid, before a single truck arrives on the construction site, before any tangible material exists in that space, the entire building exists in a state of Amr.
So it's pure design.
Yes, it is the command or the algorithm that will dictate how reality behaves, but it is entirely without physical form yet.
Okay, so if we stick with the software analogy, MHAR is the logic of the software architecture existing in the developer's mind or sketched on a whiteboard before a single line of code is actually compiled or executed. It's the governing law.
Perfect. Once the law or the blueprint of Amr is established, the system must initiate. This brings us to Ibda. And this concept is genuinely staggering from a modern scientific perspective.
Oh, so?
Well, Ibda does not mean taking some clay and molding it into a pot. Ibda means originating something from absolute, literal nothingness into being. It is the unprecedented initiation of matter.
Bringing the very concept of matter, time, and space into existence from a state of zero.
Exactly. And the lecture specifically references Dr. Maurice Bucaille here. Bucaille was a renowned French medical doctor and gastroenterologist who later deeply studied the scientific phenomena described in ancient scriptures.
Right.
The text notes how top modern scientists look at the cosmos, trace the expansion of the universe backward, and eventually hit the wall of the Big Bang singularity. And before that singularity, physics breaks down. Science hits a wall at absolute zero. They reach a point of nothingness that they cannot mathematically or physically penetrate.
So Ibda is the word for that.
Yes, Ibda is the precise technical term for that specific, inexplicable leap from absolute zero to the very first spark of physical reality.
Mind-blowing. So Amar is the underlying blueprint, Ibda is the Big Bang, the explosion from nothing to something, and then we move to the third phase, Khalq. What happens here? Because Ibda just happened, we have a universe full of chaotic, expanding plasma and raw elements.
Right, raw material alone isn't a functioning universe. This is where Khalq comes in. Khalq is the physical execution, the ongoing evolutionary process of the universe. It means combining existing materials in the correct, precise proportions to form something new and complex.
Like stars forming from gas clouds.
Exactly. Planets forming from accretion disks, amino acids combining to form proteins, is the continuous balancing and proportioning of reality.
It's the evolutionary grind.
Yes, and what is linguistically brilliant here is the etymological link. The Arabic root of khalq, which carries this meaning of physical creation through precise proportion, is the exact same root as the word akhlaq.
Wait, akhlaq, meaning ethics.
Yes, human character, morals, or ethics.
Okay, hold on, let me make sure I'm getting this. Physical creation, like building a biological cell or a solar system, and human ethics are linguistically tied together by the concept of correct proportion.
That is exactly the argument being made. Think about it systemically. Building a functioning biological cell requires chemical elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, to be combined in the exact right proportions. If you get the proportions wrong, you don't get life. You get poison or you get inert matter.
Okay, I see.
Similarly, building a functioning, ethical human society requires human behaviors, capacities, and laws to be balanced in the exact right proportions. Justice balanced with mercy. Freedom balanced with responsibility. Individual ambition balanced with collective welfare.
If those social elements are out of proportion, the society becomes toxic and collapses.
Exactly. So calc is an ongoing evolutionary process of refinement and balancing, both physically and sociologically. It is not a magical poof where things just appear fully formed and perfect. It is a grueling, continuous system of combination, adaptation, and complexification.
That is a staggering way to view existence. But, it forces a massive question for us right now. If the universe is this continuous, massive evolutionary process of Amar to Ibda to Khalq, what does that mean for humanity today? Are we done? Have we reached the finish line of evolution? Because physically, human beings haven't changed that much in the last 100,000 years.
The lecture addresses this head-on by introducing the concept of nachat al-ukra. This translates to the next creation, or the next phase of evolution, and the speaker draws a very sharp, almost brutal distinction between biological repetition and sociological evolution. Let's look at the biological timeline. Take a goat, for example.
A goat.
A goat.
Wow.
Biologically, a goat reached its evolutionary peak a very, very long time ago. The physical hardware is perfectly adapted to eating grass, climbing rocks, and surviving in its environment. So for millennia, what does a goat do? It just duplicates itself, it eats, it reproduces, and it dies.
The next generation of goats does exactly the same thing.
Right. It is mere biological cloning. There is no ideological or technological progress in a herd of goats.
Right, they aren't building goat universities or inventing goat internet.
Exactly. And the lecture also mentions the giant dinosaur skeletons you see in museums. These were creatures with massive physical power, dominance over their environment, absolute biological supremacy in their era. But their environment changed, and they failed to adapt.
Because they just relied on physical bulk?
Exactly. They hit a biological wall, and their sheer physical bulk couldn't save them. In fact, their bulk became a liability. They went extinct because they couldn't evolve past their physical limitations.
So how does this apply to humans and the Nashat al-Ukra?
For humans, the Nashat al-Ukra implies that we cannot rely merely on biological reproduction or physical dominance to survive. If human beings just exist to eat, reproduce, build bigger houses, and duplicate the stagnant ideas of our ancestors, we are functioning no differently than a herd of goats or a pack of doomed dinosaurs.
We are just biological cloning machines.
Yes, but humanity's next phase of evolution isn't biological. It is sociological, intellectual, and ideological.
Our evolution has moved from the hardware to the software.
Brilliantly put, yes. We must continuously refine our intellect, our systems of justice, our economic models, and our understanding of universal laws. Mere repetition of the past, saying this is how our fathers did it, so this is how we will do it, without forward ideological momentum, inevitably leads to civilizational extinction.
Okay, this brings us to a massive psychological contradiction, and I really want to dig into this. If standing still is so dangerous, if the fire of Jahim burns any stagnant system, and if evolving is a literal universal imperative, why on earth is human history filled with societies that actively choose to stop? Why do we fight progress so hard? What is the psychological payoff of stagnation?
This is where we return to Abraham's sociological diagnosis in verse 25, and we explode the myth of shared belief. Why do people get stuck? Because of the intoxicating comfort of the idol system. Abraham looks at his society, which is rigid, stagnant, and refusing to evolve, and he tells them, essentially, you have constructed this system of idols not because they represent objective truth, but because they provide mawada.
Let's unpack that word, mawada.
Mawada translates to mutual affection, solidarity, intimacy, or in-group belonging in this worldly life.
This is the crux of the whole thing. The real glue holding their stagnant society together isn't a shared pursuit of reality. They don't actually care if the wooden statue controls the rain. Deep down, they probably know a block of wood doesn't do anything.
Exactly.
They care that bowing to the wooden statue gets them invited to the right parties, it gets them the right business contacts in the marketplace, it gets them a favorable marriage for their children, it makes them feel safe and warm inside the herd. The idol is just the excuse for the in-group affection. The belief is just the entry fee for the Mawada.
Precisely. The belief itself is a shared fiction, but the social benefits are very, very real. But this raises a terrifying systems engineering question. What happens when a society is bonded by a fiction rather than reality? What happens when the operating system refuses to update, but the environment around it changes?
The system crashes.
It crashes. The text uses two devastating reversal verbs to describe the psychological turn that is waiting for any group bonded by a fiction. It says that on the day of reckoning, which we shouldn't just read as an apocalyptic end-of-time event, but sociologically as the moment when the consequences of their stagnation finally catch up with them.
When the obsolete system fails.
Yes. When it fails, two specific things will happen. The Arabic verbs are yakfuru badukum bibad, which means you will disown and deny one another, and yalanu badukum badan, which means you will curse one another.
It's a complete 180-degree flip. The very affection, that mawada that united the group, instantly inverts into toxic recrimination because the bond wasn't based on a shared effort to grow, to adapt, and to understand the universe. It was based on everyone winking at each other and agreeing to uphold a comfortable lie.
Exactly. It's built on sand.
And when I read this, I immediately thought of the collapse of a massive corporate fraud. Think about something like Enron or Theranos, or the end of a charismatic cult, or even a highly polarized, toxic political faction.
That corporate fraud analogy is perfect for understanding the mechanics of Mawada. Walk us through the stages of that collapse.
Okay, think about a massive corporate fraud at its peak. While the fiction holds, while the fake accounting is working, the fake blood testing machines are supposedly revolutionizing medicine, and the stock price is soaring, the internal solidarity of that company is absolute.
They probably call themselves a family.
Exactly. We are a family. We are changing the world. They have immense mawada. They go on corporate retreats. They give each other awards. They have inside jokes. They wear the branded fleece vests. They belong.
And what happens to the skeptics?
Oh, the social cost of being the skeptic, the whistleblower, is total excommunication. If you point out that the math doesn't make sense, you are fired, ostracized, and sued. So everyone agrees to believe the fiction because the warmth of the in-group is so profitable.
But then the environment moves. The objective reality asserts itself.
Right. The second the systemic failure occurs, the second the Wall Street Journal publishes the expose, or the feds walk in with boxes, or the bank accounts freeze, that is their day of reckoning. And what happens to the affection? Does the corporate family hold hands and sing songs as they go down?
Never. Not once in history.
It instantly morphs into mutual betrayal. The executives immediately start pointing fingers. The CEO disowns the CFO. The board curses the accountants. They all rush to testify against one another to save their own skin. Yakfuru and yalanu. They disown and they curse.
The social glue turns into a highly volatile acid because the solidarity was always transactional, built on the fragile foundation of a shared, unproven assertion.
Yeah.
This is the structural fragility of any in-group that refuses to base its cohesion on objective truth. And this brings us to a critical pivot point in the lecture, the engine of reason and the diagnostic of violence. Because Abraham's critique isn't just an observation, it is a rational assault on a fragile system.
Right. Any bond built on a shared fiction only holds together as long as the fiction remains unchallenged from the outside, and as long as the social costs of believing it are low.
And here we see Abraham not as a sentimental religious figure or a pious mystic, but as a master logician. He brings a razor-sharp, rational argument against their systemic stagnation. He points out the absurdity of their system. He disrupts their comfortable jaheen.
He calls out the exhausted camels.
He essentially tells them they're acting like exhausted camels, falling behind the march of reality, and that their social cohesion is built on sand. He is demanding that they update their civilizational operating system.
And how does the establishment respond? Because this is the most telling part. When someone points out a logical flaw in a system, a healthy system responds with data. Do they form a debate committee? Do they present counter-evidence to prove that their idols actually do control the economy and the weather?
Look at the text in verse 29.24. The establishment answers his intellectual, reasoned argument with a purely physical threat. Their immediate response is, kill him or burn him.
It's such an extreme escalation. He says, your logic is flawed, and they say, set him on fire.
It is extreme, but from a systems perspective, it makes perfect sense. This response is perhaps the most profound sociological diagnostic tool in the entire text. When a solidarity fiction, an idol system, can no longer defend itself rationally, it defaults to violence.
Violence is the diagnostic metric of a failing ideology.
Exactly. Let's break down why. A system built on objective truth, a system aligned with the universal laws of calc and evolutionary progress, doesn't need to burn its critics. Why? Because it can simply demonstrate its truth. If I say 2 plus 2 equals 4 and you argue it equals 5, I don't need to assassinate you.
Right, you just prove it.
I could just show you the math, I can point to the results, my system works.
But if my power, my wealth, and my entire social network depend on everyone believing that 2 plus 2 equals 5, your math equation is an existential threat to my life.
Yes. A system built on mawadda, on in-group affection, based on a lie, experiences a rational argument not as an intellectual debate, but as a lethal threat to its very survival. The torch, the sword, the censorship, the coercion, these are the ultimate confessions of intellectual bankruptcy.
Wow.
When you see a society, a group, or an institution reaching for violence to silence a critique, you are watching a system that knows its internal fiction is collapsing. They cannot argue, so they must burn the arguer.
So what does this mean for the reformer? Does the violence work? Does burning the critic actually protect the stagnant system in the long run? This brings up the concept of mukafati amal, the law of requital, and the reality of what the text calls azab.
Right, mukafati amal is essentially the cosmic law of cause and effect. It is the inescapable reality that actions have systemic consequences. And the lecture explains that this law runs two ways. First, look at the historical narrative of Abraham. The establishment builds a massive fire, they throw him in, but the fire fails to consume him.
Okay, let's look at this non-literally from the systems engineering perspective we've established. What does the fire failing to burn him represent?
Sociologically speaking, this signifies that the violent defense of a fiction cannot permanently halt a reformer who is aligned with the forward momentum of universal laws. You can intimidate a scientist, you can burn a philosopher's books, you can imprison a reformer, you might delay progress, you might cause temporary suffering, but you cannot burn the evolutionary imperative of the universe.
The truth survives.
The truth survives the fire because the truth is supported by the fundamental physical architecture of reality. The system of Amr, Ibda, and Kalk will keep moving forward, with or without the stagnant society.
And what happens to the society that lit the fire? The society that refused to evolve? The lecture radically redefines a concept that has been widely misunderstood for centuries, and that is azaba. Usually this is translated into English as punishment. And again, just like with the word sin, we have all this mythological baggage. When we hear punishment, we think of lightning bolts striking from the heavens. We think of an angry deity actively smiting a village.
But the text offers a completely different systemic definition. Azab is not mythic lightning. It is not an arbitrary magical intervention. Azab is the natural sociological consequence of stagnation. It is the deprivation of life's bounties as a direct result of falling out of sync with reality.
Cause and effect.
Yes. The lecture explains that the idolater's own bond, that fake mawadda, becomes their punishment. The consequence of bonding over a falsehood is that the relationship itself becomes a prison of paranoia, anxiety, and eventual betrayal. You don't need lightning from the sky to punish Enron. The internal rot and the FBI raid are the natural consequences of the fraudulent system.
It's a self-inflicted sentence. By refusing to update their operating system, by choosing to stand still in Jahim and violently enforce their fiction, they sentence themselves to become historical fossils. The lecture brings back that image of the giant dinosaur skeletons. Those creatures had massive bulk, they had terrifying power, they thought they ruled the earth, but because they couldn't adapt, their very bulk became their tomb.
Okay.
The stagnation was their azab. They were left behind by the caravan of existence. The exhausted camel dies in the desert, not because the desert is punishing it, but because it stopped walking.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of the lecture.
Yeah.
The distinction between the permanent principles of human societies versus the changing variables. Across eras, across millennia, the superficial variables change. The idols are constantly rebranded.
Right. In the ancient world, they were literal stone statues of fertility gods or rain gods. In the medieval world, they might have been the divine right of kings or strict feudal loyalties. In the modern world, the idols are much sleeker. They are corporate logos, they are rigid political factions, they are nationalistic myths or sectarian dogmas.
But the permanent principle remains exactly the same. The underlying algorithm does not change. Solidarity built on a shared fiction is a social glue that will inevitably turn to acid the moment the reality check arrives. And that system will always reach for violence, censorship, or coercion when it can no longer argue rationally.
The loop just keeps going.
The dynamic, affection over falsehood, leading to the violent defense against reason, ending in mutual betrayal, is a constant, repeating loop in human history.
So how do we break the loop? If human nature is so prone to falling into these comfortable, stagnant in-groups, how do we force ourselves into the Nashat al-Ukra, the next evolution? To illustrate this, the lecturer integrates the profound poetry of Allama Iqbal. And this part is beautiful, but it requires some unpacking.
Iqbal writes extensively about how life is a continuous, necessary clash between constructive and destructive forces. He argues that peace, in the sense of total stillness and lack of challenge, is actually death. He uses the beautiful metaphor of how a pearl is formed.
No, a pearl sounds like a lovely, peaceful thing. You wear it on a necklace, it's smooth, it's perfect.
But think about the biology of how it gets there. Let's look at the actual mechanism. A drop of spring rain or a grain of sand doesn't become a precious pearl by resting comfortably on a soft leaf in the sunlight. To become a pearl, it must endure trauma. It must enter the dark, suffocating environment of an oyster.
And from the oyster's perspective, that grain of sand is an irritant. It's a threat to its internal system.
Exactly. It is an external reality intruding on the oyster's comfortable status quo. So the oyster defends itself. It subjects that irritant to immense pressure, absolute darkness, heat, and biological struggle. It secretes nacre to coat the irritant. The pearl is literally the physical record of a biological struggle. It is structural transformation under pressure.
No struggle, no pearl.
Precisely. To avoid the struggle is to choose the state of the exhausted camel. It is to choose death. You have to endure the pressure, the friction of reality, to create something of enduring value.
But what do you do when you are stuck inside a society that absolutely refuses to endure that pressure? A society that wants to stay a stagnant pond, a corporate culture or political faction that is hopelessly committed to its idol system and is actively trying to burn anyone who points out the need to evolve. You can't just stay there and let them set you on fire.
This is where we see the final rational systems engineering decision in the text. In verse 29.26, we see another figure, Lut, aligning with Abraham's rational belief. And Abraham makes a definitive move. He announces, I am migrating to my Rab. Rab being the Arabic term denoting the source of sustenance, development, and universal laws of growth. This concept of hijra, or migration, is absolutely critical to the entire blueprint.
Let's really unpack hijra, because to a modern ear, migrating or fleeing sounds like running away. It sounds like losing. It sounds like a retreat from the debate.
It is the exact opposite of a retreat. From a systems perspective, it is the most active, rational choice available. Imagine you are a brilliant software engineer, and you realize the company you work for is running all of its infrastructure on a corrupted, obsolete operating system. You try to tell management, we need to update the code, or the servers will crash. Management responds by threatening to fire you and sue you if you don't shut up and praise the old system.
Because their bonuses depend on the old system looking good for one more quarter.
Right. So do you stay in the burning building, trying to argue with the flames? Do you try to write next-generation software on a corrupted hard drive that actively deletes your work? No. The rational engineer doesn't stay. The only logical move is to exit the doomed cohesion. You leave the company, you take your skills, and you build a new startup on a stable, reality-based architecture.
Migration is the physical initiation of the Nashat al-Ukra. It is the deliberate, necessary act of leaving the obsolete, dying system to build a new one that is aligned with the universal laws of progress and evolution. You cannot build the future while you are chained to the idols of the past. You have to pack your bags, leave the exhausted camels behind in the desert, and step out into the unknown to build a society based on objective reality and continuous growth.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of human history, Abraham's migration is the ultimate testament to human agency. We are not trapped by the fictions of our ancestors unless we actively choose to be. We are not doomed to die with the dinosaurs. We have the capacity, and indeed the evolutionary imperative, to observe the universe, challenge stagnant orthodoxies, endure the pressure of the oyster, and migrate toward better systems. Migration isn't cowardice. It is the ultimate act of civilizational courage.
Which brings us to our final thought. And I want to address you, the listener, directly. Take a moment and look closely at your own life right now. Put on that systems engineer hat. Look at the in-groups you belong to, whether it's a culture at your workplace, your fierce political affiliations, the dynamics within your extended family, or your closest social circles.
It applies everywhere.
It really does. Ask yourself the hard, uncomfortable question. Are those bonds truly built on the shared pursuit of objective reality, growth, and continuous evolution? Are you challenging each other to update your mental operating systems? Are you enduring the friction required to create pearls?
Or are you just avoiding the fire?
Right. Or are you simply bonded by a comforting, stagnant fiction, an idol? Because if your group cohesion relies on ignoring reality, suppressing questions, and silencing critics just to keep the mutual affection alive, you are standing on a highly fragile trapdoor. You are in Jahim. That fiction will eventually demand that you betray your own intellect. And when the system inevitably crashes under the weight of reality, it will demand that you betray each other. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of civilizational survival. Until next time, keep questioning the glue that holds your world together. Never settle for being the exhausted camel, and don't be afraid to migrate toward the truth.